Hello and welcome to this video 1 for weeks 6 to 7 of Language Learning and Wellbeing. You look fine, invisible illnesses from mind to body and back again. This video is going to focus in particular on the notion of legitimacy and visibility in relation to both disability and illness. We're going to talk about physical health and mental health. And at the very end of this video there is a brief reference to suicide, so if you don't want to view that part of the video, that's absolutely fine. I'll put the time tags in the top of this video so you know at what point to pause it. So let's begin then by thinking about how we know that somebody has a disability or an illness. This is a real note. It's one of the ones which is a subject of one of the tasks that you've been asked to complete in relation to this week, that was left on somebody's car. It says, I have a video of you walking away from your car on numerous occasions. You are not handicapped. They were parked in a handicapped or a disabled space. The next time you park here, I will forward the videos to the police with your license number. You should be ashamed of yourself. This, I think, is an interesting point for us to start with, because this driver in fact had a prosthetic leg, but evidently because that was not immediately visible to this person who was observing them parking in a space that was supposed to be reserved for people with disabilities, that they were incensed enough to type out this note, print it off and presumably leave it on this person's car. So interesting to think about what constitutes visibility in relation to illness or disability, because I think we could make a crude initial statement that perhaps mental health is typically not visible and physical health issues typically are. And as we progress through this and the second video, I really want to challenge some of those assumptions and assertions, and here we evidently have an example of somebody with a physical disability which was not immediately apparent. So thinking then about some of the many ways in which visibility in relation to disability or illness can manifest, and I've just got some images for you here to get you started on thinking about this. It's interesting to reflect on how we can tell whether or not somebody has a disability or an illness, be that something which is temporary or something which is chronic and long-term, be that something which is very minor or something which is very serious. There are obvious tropes that people will often draw on when they're representing disability in a visual way, things like wheelchairs, things like sticks that people who are blind use to support them walking around, things like guide dogs. We might have things that are more temporary, like this lady represented in the middle, who is got visible signs that she's not necessarily quite well. Her eyes perhaps are looking particularly puffy, her nose looks quite red. What's quite interesting here is, whilst this suggests that perhaps this woman has some sort of illness and is something that's physically visible, it's very difficult to tell from these signs. There are multiple reasons that this could be the case. She might be hungover, she might just have a cold, she might be very upset and have been crying for a long time, which is not necessarily unrelated to possibly not having an illness at all, possibly a symptom of another illness, be that physical or mental. We cry for all sorts of reasons, not just related to mental health, but if we are in physical pain, we may cry as well. Interestingly as well, this lady who is represented on the left-hand side of the screen doesn't actually, it's from a stock image, doesn't actually, as far as I'm aware, have an illness, but loss of hair is something which we often associate with chemotherapy and cancers. So interesting too to think about some of the ambiguities surrounding some of these physical indicators that someone may have an illness or a disability. Interesting too to think about how easy or difficult some of these things are to conceal. If you are a permanent wheelchair user, it is very difficult in many scenarios, though perhaps in the context of a Zoom call it has become easier, but in most contexts it would be very difficult to conceal that disability. In many other contexts, for instance wearing wigs, using other things, think about the driver in the slide that I've just shown you, clearly was able to hide a prosthetic leg well enough that somebody observed him and didn't think that there was anything wrong. So really interesting to think about the opportunities and limitations that are afforded to different people on the basis of how visible or invisible their illness or disability is. And we're going to talk a lot today about some of the challenges of invisible illnesses, but interesting too to think about opportunities to conceal when that may be desirable, in particular in contexts where people are worried that they are going to be stigmatised or treated differently as a result of their disability, that some are easy to temporarily at least conceal and others are not. And at the same time, we could think back to our week on substance use and think about substance use as a particular form of illness, something which is typically physically visible, that when we look in popular media and we look at representations of people with serious substance use issues, that they are often represented in a particular way. This is something that we talked about earlier in the module. But I'll bring you back again to Corey Monteith and Philip Seymour Hoffman, both of whom were very famous actors and both of whom died of heroin overdoses as a result of long-term substance issues with that particular drug. One of the reasons that people were very surprised was because their wealth, presumably, and social status enabled them to refrain from acquiring any physical visibility that they had an illness going on at all. Whereas for people in lower income brackets, that is obviously much harder to maintain if you are choosing, having to fund a drug habit and feed yourself and wash yourself and keep a roof over your head. These things can become financially very difficult very quickly for people from lower income. So interesting too to think about the reasons why particular illnesses may be manifest when we look at a person for some people and not for others. We might think about oral visibility, so things that we can tell from listening to. I'll put a copy of these slides in case you would like to view the videos that are offered in the links here today onto the Blackboard site. This is a comedian. On the left-hand side, she has cerebral palsy, and when she performs her stand-up, it is orally, from listening to her, visible in that sense that she has some sort of illness, some sort of disability, in a manner that you couldn't necessarily tell by looking at her. Similarly on the right, this young man was represented in one of the Educating series a few years ago. He has a stammer, something that we're going to be looking at in a later week, looking at representations of communications disorders. Again, not something that you could tell by listening to, by looking at him, but by listening to him speak, it would over time become apparent that this was something which caused him an issue. We might too think about behavioural visibility, so something which, by listening to somebody in terms of the tone and the pace of their voice, or looking at how they walk, or looking at for physical indicators, that there is no indication whatsoever that they have any sort of illness or disability. But thinking about things like autism spectrum disorders in particular, and I'm going to use these terms like disorders and disability and illness quite crudely in this session, because later in the module Susan Anderson is going to talk to you about whether or not those are things that are appropriate labels or not, but I'm going to leave that for later in the module. But don't think that I'm ignoring that those terms can be potentially highly problematic. But interesting to think about some of the behaviours that people might manifest that might indicate to somebody quite quickly. Whether or not that is accurate, of course, is another question, but might give people a sense that perhaps this behaviour is not something which is typical, not something which is necessarily neurotypical, and may indicate therefore that there is some sort of illness or disability sitting in the background prompting these behaviours. So all of these things then highlight to us that there are many, many different ways in which illness and disability can be visible or can be invisible, some of which are fairly unambiguous indicators. So things like permanent wheelchair use and being in a wheelchair is a relatively visible sign of illness or disability, and something which is very difficult to conceal. But at the other end of the spectrum, there are all sorts of illnesses and disabilities which are not physically, mentally, orally, or behaviourally apparent. In particular, medically unexplained symptoms, which is sometimes in the UK called chronic pain syndrome, is a particular type of disorder, a particular type of medical issue where people have pain in particular parts of their body, which is persistent, which is ongoing. This can manifest in terms of things like backache or headaches. There's all sorts of variety of ways in which it can manifest. That following a series of investigations to try and find a cause for these symptoms cannot be attributed to disease following clinical investigation. So this would be an example where, for instance, somebody goes and looks at someone's back, having persistent and chronic back pain that is perhaps extremely debilitating, and can find no medical or clinical reason for this particular symptom. Now, this is a really, really interesting area for us to think about, because legitimacy and people calling into question whether or not somebody is actually ill or somebody is actually disabled is a fascinating area for us to reflect on in relation to this topic, and thinking about the intersections between visibility and invisibility of particular conditions, and where legitimacy is often raised as a question, is a really, really interesting area. So Soinska, who some of you will have read in one of the 3 choices of your reading this week, and will therefore be a bit more familiar with this study, looked at interviewing people who had these medically unexplained symptoms. And what she found was that they used to share their stories, these 3 different kinds of narrative: chaos narratives, legitimacy narratives, and restitution narratives. Chaos narratives tended to go back and forth, not have a particularly clear arc or sort of narrative trajectory, because these medically unexplained symptoms had still not been resolved, were unable to be effectively treated, because of course if we cannot find a clinical reason for somebody being in pain, it becomes something which is very difficult to treat. This is something which is often referred to as psychosomatic pain, which is pain which appears to be caused not by a physical issue in the body, but perhaps by some underlying mental issue that is causing physical pain throughout the body. I'm going to talk to you about this later in the video, and in particular in video 2. But there is a wealth of evidence that shows that mental poor well-being can cause physical bodily symptoms. Legitimacy narratives, talking about having to argue, having to justify, constantly feeling as though their issues were being questioned, as though they were being treated perhaps by work, perhaps by family, perhaps by friends, as though they were being a hypochondriac, that they were overreacting, or even that they were making these symptoms up. And restitution narratives, which is talking about coming to find a way to deal with and treat these medically unexplained symptoms, and the narrative of emerging from the other side of them as well. So really interesting then to think about particular contexts in which particular illnesses and disabilities tend to be called into question in terms of their legitimacy, and people who are experiencing them are perhaps doubted. And interesting to think which ones these are. So medically unexplained symptoms, chronic pain is a classic example of this. ME, chronic fatigue syndrome as it's sometimes called, is another really common one. Various mental health issues, and ADHD is another really key area where these legitimacy narratives often come into question. And it's interesting too to think about the forms in which this querying of legitimacy actually takes place. So sometimes it is an issue where people will query the very legitimacy of the disorder or the illness itself. Overeating, body dysmorphia, and binge eating disorder are very, very common examples of this. Binge eating disorder in particular, which is a particular type of disordered eating which tends to cause people to gain large amounts of weight and have some severe difficulties controlling their food intake, is something which, in particular if you think back to the discourses of nutrition session that we looked at a few weeks ago, a really interesting one where many people will call into question whether or not, despite the fact that it is in all of the medical manuals and it is treated by the medical profession as a real illness, as something that is viewed with scepticism, and interesting for us to reflect on why that might be. In other contexts, depression being a really good example of this, legitimacy is not called into question in terms of whether or not the actual clinical issue is real. So you will find very few people who will deny the idea that depression itself is real, but might look to an individual and say depression is real, but I don't think that you have it. And again, really interesting for us to reflect on why it is that people feel that they can pass these judgments and make these assessments of other people. So this raises a really interesting field of consideration for us here around discourses of legitimacy, and it's a particular theme in the research surrounding invisible illnesses which are very difficult to identify by looking at a person or from passing interactions with them, where the legitimacy and credibility of the illness, even when patients have a diagnosis from a medical professional, can be called into question. Sometimes this manifests in public doubt around the legitimacy of the condition, and at other times there will be a belief that the condition exists, but doubt whether an individual has it. You can see an image of Kanye West here, very, very interesting example of somebody who has been relatively open in recent years about the fact that he experiences bipolar disorder, an illness which at certain times will manifest in very, very distinct ways, and at other times will not appear to display any symptoms at all. And interesting to think about how those kinds of illnesses and conditions can raise these issues of legitimacy and how they are treated in popular discourse. In particular, how sympathetic or unsympathetic portrayals of people experiencing these kinds of issues are. Now, this is a really, really important thing for us to think about, and building on many of the things that we've talked about in this module so far in relation to thinking about structural equities and inequities within our society, about how different people are more or less well equipped to maintain a good sense of well-being, and particular aspects of the intersections between health and well-being in other aspects, thinking particularly about financial, economic ability to get and maintain a job, and how that intersects with this idea about visibility and invisibility, and in particular this notion of legitimacy. So how much more difficult is it, for instance, if you are having to take a lot of time off work because of an illness or a disability? How different is that if you have an illness or a disability which has never and nobody ever would call into question that you have it, versus something where it may be the case that people might be sceptical about whether or not this condition is real or it is poorly understood, or query whether you as a particular individual have it. So this raises a really interesting question, I think, about diagnostic invisibility. So is it the case when we think about things like medically unexplained symptoms that are believed to be psychosomatic, that are something that is caused by the mind but manifests physically in the body, typically are viewed with a higher degree of skepticism. Their credibility is sometimes caused into question. So if it is impossible or very, very difficult to obtain a diagnosis for an issue because perhaps it's very rare or perhaps it's got some very complex underlying reasons to what is causing this issue, is there an issue that is raised there? And Japp and Japp, I think, offer a really interesting reflection on this, which we're going to talk about in the next live session. So they say, without medical acceptance of the validity of illnesses, social, legal and economic acceptance is difficult, if not impossible, leading sufferers to experience social stigma, devaluation and economic hardship. So think about, for example, being entitled to draw disability benefits from the government and how challenging that may be if symptoms are not something which are easily diagnosable. We could think about this too in terms of medicating illnesses and disabilities. Now I'm thinking in particular here about mental health issues, and there is one of the studies that some of you will have looked at and read in your choice of reading this week talks about ADHD. So there is a lot of critique that exists around medicating different illnesses, and people, particularly in the wider public, and this is often very manifest in our media, lots of really examples of this that you could look at if you were interested in pursuing this for an assignment, about whether it is or isn't appropriate to take medication. So antidepressants is a particular area that we could think about in relation to this, where there is often a narrative that manifests around depression that when somebody takes antidepressants, that the goal should be to stop taking them at a later point, even if they are not causing any side effects or symptoms that are problematic and are successfully managing somebody's depression. Interesting to think about whether or not this would be the case if we were talking about something like, for instance, a broken arm or chronic pain that was somehow otherwise visible. So in particular, these invisible illnesses can often attract controversy in discussions around whether or not it is appropriate to take medication. And this is particularly interesting when we think about ADHD, and particularly interesting when we think about this being a context in which a child is experiencing an illness or a disability, and it is the decision of a parent to decide whether or not to medicate it. And this study by Bloom talked a little bit about the gendered aspect of this, and in particular the stigma that was often placed on mothers whose children had conditions such as ADHD. And they found that they were in something of a catch-22, where both medicating their children and not medicating their children was treated with disdain by various aspects of the people around them. So many of them reported that they cringed from the cultural suspicion that they medicate their kids just to quell annoying behaviour, and this of course stems back to ideas that some people don't believe that ADHD is a legitimate and real illness, in spite of the fact that people will have a medical diagnosis that says that it is. So a suggestion then that behaviours that are the only indications perhaps to people who are dealing with this child in passing are ambiguous because they overlap with other behaviours that they may recognise. So, well, my child can be a bit annoying as well, I wouldn't put them on medication. Attracting this sort of stigma and calling into question the judgments of these mothers in choosing to do so. But at the same time, many of these other mothers who were dealing with children who had complex diagnoses of ADHD were being considered negligent for underuse of medicating their children when they went to, for instance, school and acted out a particular behaviour, that this was also something that was treated as being a bad parent, and in particular a bad mother, through failure to medicate. So interesting to think about all of the different discourses that exist around medication and how these intersect with ideas about visibility, invisibility and legitimacy. Last but not least then, thinking back again to illness without diagnosis. So experiencing symptoms is, by its very nature, must precede a diagnosis. Often people will experience symptoms and determine that they do need to go to a doctor, or that they don't need to go to a doctor, or they need to go to a doctor urgently. These are the things that inform our decisions, for instance, to present at accident and emergency or call 999, compared to decisions to call our GP, compared to, for many people, decisions to just live with symptoms and not seek a diagnosis. Invisibility then is not something which always only extends to the people around an individual who is experiencing a health difficulty, but can sometimes extend to the patient themselves, who perhaps does not even realise that they are ill, because they don't recognise the symptoms that they are experiencing as being something which have a medical, clinical reason underpinning them. This in particular is a case for mental health issues. So people will often experience a period of deteriorating mental well-being and mental health, and there may be a long time before they recognise that this is something which perhaps is something which requires medical treatment. Other issues like substance use and disordered eating, topics that we've covered earlier on in the module, are also things where perhaps in these cases people around an individual, around the potential patient, may recognise symptoms before the individual does or is willing to recognise them themselves. So what is the distinction, for example, between somebody who drinks heavily and somebody who has a substance issue with alcohol? So interesting too to think about these different indicators of illness and unwellness, and the differences in opportunity for treatment that exist if somebody never interacts with a medical professional. Now, this is something that I'm going to talk about in more detail in the second video, but this is something which the research very clearly shows us has a heavily gendered aspect to it, because it is a particular issue for men. Men, due to many sort of patriarchal structures that we have in our society, that tell men from a young age that they need to present as being strong, that they need to be fine all the time, that they should man up and deal with any sort of issue without going crying to a doctor. All of these very toxic messages that men are fed from a young age manifests in them being much less likely to seek medical help even when symptoms do become visible to them. And this is something which is a very, very serious issue in our society that leads to clear patterns in men's health, for everything like late diagnosis of serious physical illness to greater likelihoods of dangerous substance use as a result of self-medication, all the way to much higher rates of suicide in the male population than the female population as a result of untreated mental health problems. So men are much less likely to go to the doctor whether or not it's something which is a physical pain, and this can often mean that things which may have been very easily treatable can become very difficult to be treated because of the late presentation with a medical professional, all the way over to things which result in very, very serious consequences for that individual as a result of an unwillingness or a sense that it is not appropriate for them to seek medical attention. So I hope you've enjoyed this video and that it's given you lots to think about. There are lots of suggestions in the further reading for this week around potential topics that you could explore in relation to this particular topic if it's something you're interested in pursuing for an assignment. And the second video will delve into some of these issues a little deeper. Thank you very much for listening.